So week 2 is going to focus on pedagogy. It's going to focus on geographic coordinates, and you're going to learn how to use Google Earth, change the settings to help you understand latitude and longitude. So I want to lecture a little bit about pedagogy. There's a very in-depth reading. It's probably the longest and the most difficult reading of the term. But for me, when I talk about pedagogy for this course and for these types of lessons, I'm talking about the way the content is delivered. So I love inquiry. I don't know a teacher who doesn't love inquiry, and it just brings about those aha moments. So I thought this was a great cartoon. However, sometimes inquiry is not the appropriate method for teaching. You would never give a student a 2x4 and put them on the table saw and say, just play around with it and see what happens. You just wouldn't do that. And this cartoon here says, there's a slight accident in shop class. I glued my braces together. And the reading talks about, before kind of figuring out how students can develop that expertise for inquiry, we need to know, do they have the skills? And so if I just gave a student Google Earth, he might or she might be able to fly around, move it around, be really intrigued by the images, but they would miss the real power of some of these tools. They wouldn't have the skills to really open up their ability to do exploration and inquiry. So I was just dumbfounded the other day to hear we don't teach cursive anymore. I feel like my grandmother now, you're supposed to teach the old style stuff. Anyway, but we believe in teaching students skills. We teach them how to create a graph. What are the step-by-step ways that you set up your x-axis, your y-axis. There are specific things that we do that teach students the skills that they need to be successful. And so we learn a lot about student-directed learning, this idea of inquiry, reflection, conception, formation, and the belief that it helps concept attainment. And the outcomes can be predictable, and that can be really cool. I mean, some of the best times in my classes were when we got a tangent or something came up that we hadn't even expected to talk about. And that's great, and there are places for that, and there's places in geospatial technology for that. But I believe that when students are learning, it's not the best way to introduce those kinds of things. So I think the idea of teacher-directed learning, step-by-step skill development is really useful in learning how to use tools. And as I said before, we use them for a graph, the table saw, solving polynomial equations, learning to keyboard. So when I've been teaching geospatial technology, I did a workshop with teachers around the country, and one of the things that we did through a lot of experimentation, it wasn't inquiry, by the way, but we would expose teachers to a tutorial, and this was very step by step. Click here, move your mouse this way, now click here. And we knew what the answers should be. We had predicted outcomes, and then at the end of that we invited them to play around and see what other tools they had. Then we had teachers develop a lesson on their own, also with step-by-step instructions, with the same idea, predicted outcomes and an inquiry component. And it was fascinating to me how much teachers would go through the web-based tutorials, because we had the teachers as students first, and then when they wrote their own tutorial, they would jump from, let's say, the tutorial you'll see on the web-based tutorial next week will say, click the layer button, and it'll show a picture of the layer button, and expand it and right-click on the attribute table. And the teacher would, when they did their lesson, right away jump to open the attributes and search for. I mean, they would make several jumps assuming students remembered their first experience. And what was funny is the teachers didn't even remember their first experience. They needed step-by-step instructions, not just once or twice, but several times. So when we teach with geospatial technology, I'm going to back up, we do a pretty step-by-step instructions a couple times, each time getting a little less hand-holding. We also try to talk about the data that students are going to use, and I'll try to do this for you in the next couple labs, that because the data is so critical that it really helps students understand what they're going to be doing, where the data came from, how accurate the data is, what questions they might ask. The other thing we found that just completely floored me was that the students worked really well, especially in the beginning stages, in the first and second exposure, to doing this in pairs. And I'm someone who always wanted my own computer and didn't particularly want to share, and I wanted to run the mouse. But what we found with teachers who put their students in pairs, one student would run the mouse, the other student would read the directions, and then they would switch. Those students, they slowed down, they had discussion, they got to use not just their reading ability, but their listening, speaking, and communication. And so working in pairs was really successful in helping students get through the lessons and understand what they were doing. And then the third part of the pedagogy is we try to teach the geospatial skills explicitly. So show them what pattern exploration looks like. Talk about linear patterns, how would they recognize them, and help them have the terms and the skills they needed for successful ability to talk about the geography they were actually exploring. And then finally we would ask students to think about GIS careers, and where would geospatial or GIS come into different career fields. So this was taken from Approaches to Instruction, Developing Expertise for Inquiry, and if you can't read those links and you want them, I'll be glad to send them to you. These are a little bit dated. And then the reading that you'll be doing for this week.